All right, Ken, are you here?
I am here.
Yay!
Sorry I can't be there physically with you, but I'm glad to be able to see you and hear you and participate.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. So I'm going to give Ken a shout out, as we heard yesterday from the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. The most important thing you can do is keep your spouse happy, and that's why Ken is not with us. So Ken, you get a huge shout out from S2, as they call him. So.
Well, and from my wife. So
more importantly,
I don't know what that says about our husbands, that they're happy that we're here, though.
Yeah, well, but thank you, Ken, for joining us remotely. Sure. We really appreciate it. So thank you all for being here. The topic of this panel is amplification or suppression. And one of the ideas for this panel came from a photograph. And I think you saw this described in the narrative. But when I was a little kid, in the civil rights movement was a thing. I'm going to date myself badly because I'm looking around. I'm not sure anybody else was alive on this panel. And I remember seeing that iconic photograph of the German Shepard lunging at the black protester. And that image lodged in my mind. And in part, it lodged in my mind because it was the subject of conversation among all the adults around me. Mm-hmm. And I just remember, even as a child, that power of a photograph, the power of knowledge, the power of awareness, driving the actions of independent citizens in ways that had not happened before, for whatever reason, good or bad. And so it got us sort of thinking about the press and understanding that a really important feature, as we'll talk about, is to avoid amplifying the voices of evil. How do you let people understand what's happening with sufficient depth to motivate or inspire them without unduly or inappropriately amplifying some of the bad things associated with them? So how many here heard the Scott presentation, the undercover presentation, right? Pretty powerful. But also an interesting story to be told in, a minute and a half on the evening news, right? How'd you do that? So one of the things we're going to talk about here is how reporters and editors make the decision. What's the calculus? What are the factors that run through your mind when you're deciding whether to report, how much to report, what to report? So with that easy question, Rainey, I'm going to throw it to you. And we're not taking up time to do intros, but I will ask each of you to just give a quick background of who you are and what you're doing here.
Oh, sure. I'm the editor-in-chief and executive producer of the PBS investigative series Frontline. And I've been with this series actually for 20 years. And I will say that as a director, before I became the boss, I told a lot of stories in what we now call the culture wars territory. So I spent a lot of time in conservative America telling stories about different issues that were polarizing at the time. And so my deep interest has always been in how media, especially mainstream media, can cover respectfully people who disagree and to include points of view that you wouldn't expect, especially today. The issue has become over the last few years is, what we've been talking about is how do you cover politicians? How do you cover hate? How do you cover lies? How do you call a lie a lie? When do you call a lie a lie? And how do you give context? And I would say that for Frontline, one of the biggest benefits we have is time. And one reason that I've remained committed to Frontline as opposed to going off and doing breaking news is because I started to notice this starting even 10 to 12 years ago, that the iterative 24-hour breaking news was really changing the ecosystem of journalism vetting and thoughtfulness, right? Not that journalism was perfect before, but certainly if you had the evening news, because I was in that whole milieu before Frontline, you would be having editorially deep conversations before the evening news would go out with Peter Jennings, right? They weren't perfect, but you certainly had a conversation. As the cable news came on, those conversations really were not, they didn't happen anymore because it was just breaking. And I was actually part of the team that started up MSNBC, and I could see right away what was going to happen to this iterative news breaking cycle. And you guys guys have all seen it clearly. And so Frontline has been, I wouldn't call it an oasis, but I would say an unusual place to practice journalism in 2022. Every film or documentary that you see usually has about 8 to 12 months of reporting that's gone into it. We have discrete teams. And one of the areas that we've really designated a lot of funding and time and resources to is reporting on the rise of hate, racism, and I would say anti-Semitism that runs behind a lot of the stories that we've told. So you'll hear, hopefully you'll go to A.C. Thompson's 2:30 panel. He's going to be on a panel talking about reporting for Frontline and ProPublica. But a lot of those documentaries have had to really straddle the line of how much do we amplify the people in them who are saying things that are really incendiary and dangerous, and our medium goes viral. And then how much do we step on that and push in and ask tough questions? So we are investigative journalists, so usually we're revealing things and we're putting editorial context around them. That said, there's a conversation in the edit room pretty much daily now about the power of what we do and how to pull back in some cases, and how do you, in one case, in documenting hate, one of our films, we had a Nazi that was followed by a lot of people in America. We had to cut right into the conversation almost immediately with him because of what he was proselytizing, right? And then in the edit room, there's another question. How do you pull back, and how do you share enough to understand the true danger that is facing, not just us specifically, but our democracy, and then that is inherent to, I think, the conversation writ large right now. Mm-hmm. So a lot more to say about Frontline's editorial process, but I would say it's not one that isn't without a lot of discussion and thought.
As you talk about all news changing by the changing market of newsmaking, right? And further to your comments, sort of the nightly news doesn't have enough time maybe to tell this. As one technology changes, maybe another comes online, podcasts. So we've had some interesting conversations about whether the evolution of podcast is a potential solution to the problem that Rainey identified as evolving.
Yeah, I think my name is Michelle Shepard. I was a foreign correspondent for many years with the Daily newspaper and went independent in 2018 to do more filmmaking and podcasting, which I didn't think I would fall into. But, as Laura says, I think it's become actually my favorite medium now for long-form journalism, in the way that we were just talking about, in terms of it's very difficult on daily journalism to have all the checks and balances. I mean, Frontline is the gold standard for sort of journalistic excellence. But I know from, covering the national security beat for many years, and sometimes having to file that day. I mean, you ask these questions, you still have these conversations, but you're talking a matter of hours as opposed to months. So I'm pretty happy that 20 years in now that I have sort of the time and the space to do much more longer form. And I think the nice thing about podcasting is in an era where it's really difficult to keep people's attention. I remember when I was at the paper, we would have metrics for when you would click out of a story. And I would write, let's say, a 3,000 word feature, and which would take, let's say, 5 to 7 minutes, 10 minutes to read if you're a slow reader. And the digital team would come and say, oh my goodness, 45 seconds we kept readers. And that was a great thing, that they'd read that far into a story. So it was terribly depressing. So that we're seeing that more and more. Podcasting, on the other hand, I mean, a typical series is about 3 hours. So you have 3 hours to get into the depths of this story. And even though I don't really love sort of me journalism or the talking, becoming characters yourself in stories, there is something nice with podcasting that you get to actually explain the process. So in the last podcast we did, which Scott, the FBI agent there, was undercover on the case, it was called White Hot Hate. And in that we did do an episode where I interviewed Ronaldo Nazzaro, who is the head of the base and still at large living in Russia. And it was a long interview, and we had a lot of discussion about how to then edit it and how to put it forward. But part of that episode was actually bringing listeners into our discussion. So, sort of letting people understand that we acknowledge we don't want to amplify his voice. This is why we think it's important, because we have to ask the tough questions. We have to get at what the motivation was, where he's at, just try and learn about the group. So I think that kind of helps in terms of getting, educating the public, but also bringing greater awareness of the challenges we face. I actually did take an audio clip of a bit of the podcast, if you want to hear it, if we have it teed up, if that's something. Some of the applicants and members that you approved of praised the Christchurch shooter or what Breivik did in Norway. And I actually covered that. I covered that in Utoya. It was one of the saddest terrorism cases I ever did. I couldn't associate with people who praise those actions. And yet you bring them into an organization that you created.
Right. Because they have a militant mindset that we need. I would never encourage them to go out and do things like that. If you take those phone calls that were recorded, listen to what I say to every single recruit, that we're not doing anything illegal, that's not the purpose of the base. I mean, I don't know how to make it more clear. I mean,
I've listened to a lot of the calls, but just to go back to what I was saying earlier, that somebody tells you that they admired these two horrific terrorist attacks. And, your answer was, yeah, they'd be a good asset because they're militant. They believe in militancy. I don't call that militancy. I call that terrorism.
No. I'm not saying that no, I'm saying the guys who made those comments are expressing kind of a militant mindset. I'm not saying the people who did the attacks represent that. I mean, I don't condone that. I don't support doing those type of things.
But your members expressed to you that they do support those. And that wasn't any kind of red flag for you?
I mean, unless they told me that they plan on going to do an attack, then no.
But they admired those killers. I just find that I find that chilling.
I don't agree with glorifying violence in general. But, there are, if you could imagine a group that you would consider to be freedom fighters.
One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Yes, in the complicated geopolitical morass of conflicts worldwide, this can be true. But we were talking about the man who went into mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand during Friday prayers and slaughtered 51 men, women, and children. And the man who perpetrated the Norway massacre, a bombing, and the murders at a Labour Party youth camp that left 77 dead. So sorry, that clip was a little longer than I expected, but just to give you an idea, I mean, this was the way we felt it was responsible to. He's always said that they're just, a survivalist group, and that he himself had never, encouraged acts of violence. So it's just we felt was sort of the best way, that if you're listening to that, you're coming to this, we're challenging on every aspect. I don't know if everybody agrees with that. And I might listen to it a few years later and wonder how we could do things differently, but this is just the challenge that we face.
Great. Ken, you have talked to some interesting people too over your career a little bit longer ago. Do you want to sort of share your experience with those kinds of interviews and how you put that into context in journalism?
Sure. And, I'm not a journalist. I've written books, but I'm not a day-to-day journalist. But I've, importantly worked with journalists, because for many years I was the director of the Division of Anti-Semitism and Extremism at the American Jewish Committee. I've now run a Bard Center for the Study of Hate and work with a lot of different groups around the country and the world that are focused on hate and have to deal with the media. So, I've dealt with these issues over the decades, and to me, it's a little bit more complex than just a question about the binary of amplification or suppression, although, of course, that's a serious question. And if I were forced to choose in that binary, I'd say amplification is better, especially if done as expose, which I think that podcast clip and some Frontlines work absolutely does. So I started thinking about these questions when I was at the AJC and starting in the late 80s. And there was to give you a couple of anecdotes, there was a man named Bradley Smith, who was a Holocaust denier, and he hit upon an absolutely brilliant idea. He'd offer Holocaust-denying ads to college newspapers, and the ads weren't of the praising Hitler type. They'd allege things like there was no proof that Jews were gassed at Auschwitz, or that the pictures from concentration camps of dead Jews piled like cordwood were not the result of any plans from the Nazis, but associated with disease when the Soviet army advanced at the end of the war. And then he asked, why can't we have an open debate about the Holocaust? And Smith would win either way. Either the ad was printed, usually for $200, and there was controversy and publicity, or the editors refused it and there was controversy and publicity. And some student newspaper editors saw the debate as a free speech matter. If they didn't print the ad where Smith's rights violated, they'd ask. And well, of course not. Smith had a right to say what he thought, but didn't have a right to have his ads accepted, and the papers had a right to decide for themselves what content they wanted to be associated with. So a Skidmore College editor was about to print the ad, but reached out to me and another colleague from the Jewish community in Albany, and we sent him material showing how deniers like Smith actively distorted the history of the Holocaust, that it is debated all the time, just not with liars like with an agenda like his. And the groups that were promoting it were not oddballs like those thinking the earth was flat or Elvis was still alive, but belonged to a documented network of active white supremacists and anti-Semites who are expert at taking facts out of context to charge that Jews were distorting Holocaust history. And we stressed that if Smith were to be believed, you'd have to believe that World War II historians from the US, Israel, Britain, Germany, and elsewhere had to either be all incompetent, in on a grand conspiracy, or both. And we also showed him why Holocaust denial wasn't really about the Holocaust or the facts of the Holocaust, but rather about Jews. Like the old canard of Jews poisoning wells wasn't really a debate about water quality. So then just rather than the print or not print decision, the editor took the time and put out a detailed issue examining who the deniers were, how they distorted history and science, and why they were targeting the campus. In other words, they put in the work to understand how to address the issue of hate intelligently, which journalism can do spectacularly if it puts in the time. About the same time, there were also debates about Holocaust denial websites and should they be banned. And internet service providers, of course, could determine their terms of service, but it was almost like a game of whack-a-mole. The better strategy was how to recognize denial for what it was, and some journalism helped with that. About the same time, I was working with a group opposed to David Duke, the neo-Nazi and former Klan leader, when he was an elected Republican official in Louisiana, and with rare exceptions, the media handled him absolutely awfully. A reporter would ask Duke if he were a racist, he'd deny it and charm and deflect, and the reporter would move on to the next question. But our group created tools for reporters so that when Duke said X, we gave material that could be used to demonstrate to readers that and viewers that he wasn't being honest. And Frontline did an incredibly good piece on Duke, showing one of my colleagues, a Republican state committee woman, now deceased, named Beth Brickey, who was appalled not only at Duke, but that he was so readily accepted by so many of her colleagues. She even followed him to neo-Nazi meetings and found him selling Holocaust denial books and even Mein Kampf from his legislative office. Another quick vignette. During the heydays of the militia movement, right before 1995, in the Oklahoma City bombing, the media, for the most part, had very little clue how to interview the white supremacists at the head of the movement. They'd ask the militia guy why they were so upset with the federal government. And the militia guy would claim, well, we're only defending the Constitution. And the reporter would, of course, move on to the next question. And they hadn't done their homework. Many militia guys believed that the Constitution was divinely inspired and only included the first 10 amendments, and the other ones, votes for women freeing the slaves and such, were illegitimate and in derogation of the Constitution, they believed. And there were a bunch of us watching the militias. This is 94, early in the online world. But the reporting and also some of the online bulletin boards and such were very much a double-edged sword. And yes, the militias were able to get the word out and organize, and I presume they were happy for the press because it helped them organize more easily. But the flip side of it is allowed us to see what they were doing in real time. And I was able to put out a report 10 days before the Oklahoma City bombing with a memo warning that there was a danger from an attack from those in the militia world on the anniversary of Waco, even feverish attention that they were paying to that upcoming date. One of the best reporters about the militia and the far right was the late Bill Moreland of the Spokesman Review in Spokane. He not only put in the work, his reporting didn't treat the haters as cartoon characters. You could see them as real people, and the readers in the inland Northwest could recognize them as their neighbors. But the danger that they pose came through crystal clear, much like, Laura, what you were talking about with that picture with the dog. Reading his columns was like that. And there's a webinar Moreland did for the Bard Center for the Study of Hate on how journalists should cover hate and hate groups. It's on our website. I recommend it. Finally, a few months ago, the Bard Center, in partnership with the Western State Center and the Montana Human Rights Network, published a guide for opposing hate in communities. It's a nuts and bolts manual for these groups on the local level, how to form a group in response to a hate incident, how to sustain the work of already existing groups over time. And it has a detailed section on working with the media. These groups and coalitions frequently have valuable information that could help journalists dig deeper and show what's really going on. So for me, the question isn't hiding the hate, but rather helping journalists understand it better and connecting them with groups like this that may have the information so they can expose it and the haters to their readers and viewers in a way that they can actually act upon.
I'm so glad you mentioned Bill Moreland, because when we were prepping for this and your comment that it's so important not to treat these people as cartoons. And I have a really good friend, we were talking about these issues leading up to the summit. He goes, my grandmother is an oath keeper. Mm-hmm. My grandmother is an oath keeper. And she thinks it's a really good thing because of these, 4 things that they stand for, that she believes in. Mm-hmm. And I think, and I'll just share this point of personal privilege. I mean, I think that the podcast, what we saw there, allows people like his grandmother who believes in certain things to understand that maybe there's another side too, mm-hmm. for her to just have information and evaluate for herself. And I think it's so important because there are mixed messages here, right? Some of which they're about patriotism and about being true to the country and about doing the right thing and all of those things that a lot of people gravitate to without understanding that there's and yet, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that the way that journalism can help do that for my friend's grandmother, right, is a really important thing that we shouldn't lose sight of here. And the demonization and the really easy, you're good or you're bad, I'm going to write the story and be done with it, I think is sort of lazy journalism that is really dangerous in this particular area for that reason. Alison, let me turn to you for a second, because your organization is a completely different animal, and yet I think has some really, really profound lessons to teach all of us in mainstream media. So let me turn it over to you.
Thanks. My name's Alison Campbell, and I'm a senior technical advisor for Internews. We're an international nonprofit. We're funded by USAID, State Department, European donors to support independent media globally. And so we're currently working in somewhere between 80 and 100 countries. Supporting independent media through training, mentoring, technical support, equipment, small grants, and that sort of thing. And so I was rather wondering what I could bring to this fairly US-centric gathering. But it occurred to me yesterday, I was wandering room to room and seeing all of so many amazing, the diversity of stakeholders in this space here, from the super granular community level to governance, perpetrators, victims. And it occurred to me that when we get funded to go into a country to work, all of the countries that we work in are, let's say, flawed democracies. They range from completely closed authoritarian to in danger of closing and becoming authoritarian, or somewhere on that spectrum. And the media ranges, I've just come back from a year of working with the Myanmar media in the wake of the coup. They're mostly working in exile, and it's very difficult to do news gathering on the ground. And there is a Buddhist, nationalist, extremist government and popular movements inside the country who that's where the extremism is coming, essentially state-sponsored violence. The media tend to be not particularly sophisticated. So in answer to the overarching question, much like everybody else, I would say that it's not about suppressing. As journalists, we don't like to talk about suppressing information, generally speaking, but to promote a full and well-rounded, contextualized understanding of the story over a period of time. Is the straight up answer. But it occurred to me yesterday, when we go into a country to support independent media, our space is already defined for us because we work in support of democracy. We are amongst other agents who are kind of appointed to go out into the world and shore up democracy in other people's countries. And so for us, hate-driven actions such as the Rohingya genocide just a few years ago in Myanmar, for instance, atrocities, things from large to small, are a problem for democracy. That's essentially the lens that we view it through. Ultimately, hate speech and hate-driven violence is a problem for democracy. So we kind of start there. And we need to work with journalists across the news ecosystem, from those who are dealing with breaking stories of incidents. That's actually where a lot of the media, in many of these news ecosystems, that's what they are mainly doing. It's important that they don't treat incidents as separate incidents, as news events. And where we would like to move them in the direction of is the direction of my colleagues here, who do this amazing, beautiful, long-form, well-rounded, deeply researched over time kind of work. But it's hard work to get them there. I think one of the things that we see as being really key in understanding extremist-driven hate is where the coverage of action, in encouraging journalists to dig in and go deeper and stay with it for longer, we almost immediately bump into the hinterland of a narrative that lies largely in social media space. And so here we are getting into dangerous and hate speech, but we're also just getting into the even broader misinformation landscape in general. In Myanmar, they can post very sweet and apparently benign messages on social media that are understood by the local population to be locating the position of activists, for instance, whose lives are then in danger. It doesn't look like hate speech on the surface, but it can certainly drive violent action. And so in this digging deep, the other key thing that we would encourage journalists to do is to identify in whose interests are these hateful actions, incidents, in whose interest is this that these things should take place or that they should be stoked? Because the nexus of hate action and hate speech in that place, where that is where politics comes in, and that's where we really start to see the problem being driven, where we see individuals who themselves may have no particularly hard feelings against one group or another, but if it is in their political interest to capitalize on audience emotion and drive violence from those places, that's where we need the journalists to go and be digging really deep to understand what are the patterns. We're looking for patterns of action, patterns of speech, and patterns of political engagement, because that's where movement building happens in these kinds of spaces. I'll just say briefly, how do we get them there to this kind of beautiful deep end of practice? It's hard. They can't do it alone. We're speaking about unsophisticated media environments very often. They need communities of practice. And actually, I was just saying to Michelle earlier, when I was walking around here yesterday at this conference, I realized that we are often funded. One of the deliverables that we have to deliver for our projects, which sometimes I feel like I don't know how to do this, is will we convene stakeholder meetings between media and civil society, interest groups, researchers, etc., to discuss not only hate speech, atrocities, genocide, etc., but any societal issue, to discuss and develop common solutions. And so it occurred to me yesterday that I'm now attending, actually, the kind of conference which we are usually tasked with, of mounting in the countries where we work. So I'm really delighted to see how it's actually supposed to work, and this is a really great example of that. Thanks.
Perfect. We heard, speaking of patterns, we heard from a number of people who have studied the killers in some of the more horrific events, that they are motivated, at least in part, by the desire for fame, for immortality, for being remembered, and the way they're remembered is through the press, through media, through online. How do you factor that? A, do you agree with that? And B, how do you factor that into your decisions about how and whether to write?
So actually, I was just going to pick up on the amazing work that you do internationally, because what we've noticed at Frontline with a lot of our reporting is how when we report from places from the Philippines, from Myanmar, and Frontline does a lot of international reporting, that they were actually very prescient. What was happening in the Philippines and in Myanmar is now happening here. One of our early documentaries on Facebook was called The Facebook Dilemma. We actually traveled to Myanmar and to the Philippines to see how dis and misinformation were spreading, how lies were spreading, and how, in fact, Facebook in that case, right, where it was actually the one place everybody was getting their news, and hate was spreading. So actually, it's not just a social platform where you're sharing the pictures of our kids, right? But it was their only place where they were hearing what was happening. And so if you think about that, and actually Maria Reza spoke in that Facebook Dilemma film well before she became internationally known, about how these countries and the platforms allow for something that she calls 1,000 cuts, right? It's this iterative breakdown of truth, and we've seen it here too. So once you don't know what a lie is, and once you don't know what truth is, then how do you differentiate, right? And that question is actually at the essence of all of this as journalists, is we have to understand how this ecosystem works enough to report on it. So we actually did a film called 1,000 Cuts after the Facebook Dilemma to see what was actually happening to Rappler in the Philippines, which Maria Reza runs, right? And then, of course, she wins the Nobel Peace Prize, but she's arguing that the platforms have to become part of the solution here because they are actually at the nexus point for the information ecosystem that we're all swimming in now. So we can do thoughtful documentaries on Frontline. You can do the podcast, which is, I thought, really well done. Love it. And you can do your work too, but it's actually where people are getting their information. If there isn't any mitigation there and any conversation about the health of that ecosystem, that is something that we are going to continue to report on and to hold the platforms to account for this. And it's very difficult for them too, right? Because how do they do that without completely shutting down their platforms, frankly? Mm-hmm. But this is all interconnected now. So we don't really think about international news anymore because our ecosystems have collided.
And can I just ask you really quickly, Michelle, to share a little bit of your history of the Toronto News, what you used to do and why you don't do it anymore?
Mainly resources. I mean, I really had this journalism job that was so incredible, and I don't think it exists anymore. I was, after 9/11, became national security correspondent. I was always based in Toronto, but they kind of let me report around the world for countries that mattered to the beat. So I was really lucky to not be doing the countries that were in the headlines. So, as the Afghan war was going on, I was in Pakistan doing work there, covered many years of Somalia when sort of no one was paying attention. And so it was a really, and I had lots of time to work on my stories. Unfortunately, media in the U.S. is probably quite similar. It is quite similar in many smaller towns, but in Canada it's been really difficult for the newspapers. So we no longer have a foreign department, and we're Canada's largest newspaper. So that was around that time, my husband also works there, so we figured one of us better diversify in case the paper actually went under, which felt like a real possibility for a while. Thankfully it's doing better now, but just to that idea of resources. So, because we get the New York Times, we get, if you want to find out what's going on in Pakistan, you can subscribe to Dawn. I mean, there's never been more information out there. But I think there was always an interesting Canadian lens through which we told foreign stories that mattered, internationally, but also in Canada. And that's a shame that that's gone now.
So whether it is a lack of money, whether it is online news that's in 30 seconds or less, we have seen sort of a change in the way news is reported that is, I think, detrimental to the reporting of these issues. What kind of resources would be helpful? Ken, you talked a little bit before about the materials that are available through the Bard Center, just, basic primers that will get reporters smart about what they're doing. Are there other resources that you think would be helpful to create or to exist, whether domestically or internationally, that would help frame some of these issues that we've all learned about in this setting without glorifying or fueling the saint issue that we talked about and we heard about before, which I think I think that's an issue of concern, isn't it?
Right. I think one of the biggest things we haven't spoken about yet is the dearth of local journalism that's currently, everybody knows this isn't like I'm saying anything original, but the breakdown at the local level now is so severe. Frontline's funding local journalism now, ProPublica is, like pretty much all the national news organizations are saying local journalism is where it's at, because that's how you get to the heart of not demonizing your neighbor, right? But understanding what's happening in your own communities and reporting on it in an investigative way, as opposed to just reporting what's happening at the school board. So resources for local journalism is really near and dear to me, even though I run a national news organization, because I think that's a story that's not being told. That is a huge detriment to our own democracy. And that's happened in the countries that you're supporting as well, right? Or has already happened.
Mm-hmm. Are you seeing that?
Actually, I would back that 100%. It was one of my lower down points, but I think in terms of
a lot of points here.
In terms of what we find, because we are about local, hyper-local, the more local, the better. Right. And in fact, some of the communities where we work in Africa have better community-based media than you do here in the States. So I'm not an American, I've been living here for 8 years, and so I'm looking at this, it's extremely interesting for me to see what the situation is here. Community resilience needs a local, trusted news provider. The way that you know that something is true in your community is because you can see it for your own eyes. Mm-hmm. Or if your local news provider tells you that if you want to get this service or, go there, you find that service exists, you build trust in your local news provider. It's very difficult once your news provider moves even away to a larger city and certainly becomes like statewide or national. You don't find local trusted information, and so there is no anchor any longer that people can turn to ask questions. So these news deserts that are opening up in the States, they're highly detrimental to communities and to democracy as a whole, eventually.
I am not under contract to the local newspapers, but let me just do this as a shout out to everybody who's listening to this. What can every individual person do? How many people in here subscribe to your local paper, online or otherwise? Okay, good. The rest of you could and perhaps should. But again, this is not everybody else's problem, right? Local newspapers are a thing. Subscribe to your local newspaper. Have your friends subscribe to the local newspaper. It's not a big check to write, but it's an important part of being a citizen. I think that's what we're hearing here.
It's quite confounding, actually, because I'm amazed at, good friends who support their journalism friend, and how few people, we're just so used to getting free news, so how few people actually subscribe, and the cost still is quite low. It's amazing, yeah.
But, there's a bigger problem, because if you do have to subscribe, right, to a paper, let's say you're just subscribing to the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, that's a higher cost than your local paper. And usually that's the only news that you're getting that's in depth, right? So this is another issue, is that the barrier sometimes for people to actually get this news is hard, but at the local level it's affordable still. And it's a really serious thing. And the other piece that you have pointed out, and other things that I've read that you've said, is that I think that if you look at what's happened in some of the countries that you're funding journalism, we're 5 or 6 years away from that, but we're at stage 1 or 2 here for our own journalistic ecosystem. So it's a very serious problem currently here as well.
Yeah.
We Ken, I'm gonna raise that with you only because you're the professor on the panel. One of the issues that has been sort of buzzing, I don't know if you've heard it, is we did a teen screen for Patrice's film, and the teens who were there were just mind-blowingly amazing. Just the level of their conversation. It's a facilitated conversation of people reacting to the film. Mind-blowing. And so we did this, as I think you know from some things that Mark Nordenberg said earlier, as a precursor to having a more young person education focused track for next year. But that said, young people don't consume their news through the Wall Street Journal or even their local papers. Ken, you spend a lot of time with students all the time. Where are they consuming their news, and how can that location do a better job at reporting these kinds of issues in a responsible way?
It's a great question. I mean, they're getting their news from this, but they're mostly. But, I want to branch out the conversation a little more. I agree with everything that's been said about local papers and so forth. But when you think about this, this is really a question of ideas, right? It's an ideas that define who's us, who's them, how to create something noble about and seen as self-defense of vilifying another. And those ideas have been around for, forever, right? And they've been around with different delivery systems. And we've worried about the delivery systems from, the printing press to the radio to television to the early websites. And we've seen, lots of transformations, and I'm not minimizing the impact that they have. But I think, at least to me, the part of where journalism is also cable news, and it's other pieces as well, not just print and documentary and podcast, to help people navigate these contentious issues, to understand them better, to put it in a different context. One of the things that I do on campus, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate, which, talk about third rail issues. That's one of them, right? Yeah. So intentionally, I started the book. The first chapter is called Thinking About Thinking. What I did is I pulled from the growing field of hate studies to document what happens to each of us on an individual level, from brain science to social psychology to other fields, when our identity is tethered to an issue of perceived social justice and injustice. I mean, there's a growing literature about this. And I found that if you're at least cognizant of what happens when you're getting to these, contentious issues, it helps you maybe have some empathy, to think a little bit more clearly. And I think there's a parallel in terms of what can be done in the online world, and what I think there should be more journalism that helps people navigate these issues. And the problem, I don't think it's been mentioned, but my colleague, or my not colleague, but an acquaintance, also Bard alum, Mike Taibbi, wrote a book on hate and cable news a couple of years ago, and that's part of the problem, right? It's the structure that's changed is that what sells, is that it's not a complicated problem; it's a simple problem, and it's their fault. And how do we change it? How do journalists and so forth help change that environment so that people can see the complexities, and that the people that disagree with them may not be evil, and to really sort of jump into their mindset and see the world from their point of view for a bit of time. And that's what I thought Bill Moreland's job did as a journalist, and that's I thought what Laura, you were saying about each. I remember that picture as well. I'm probably older than you, certainly older than you, and I remember that as well. And just saying, oh my God, that put me in the position of what if I was on the other side of that door.
One other systemic thing, and then I'm going to go back into storytelling and the dangers of storytelling. One of the other phenomenon in the delivery system of news is click news, where you get paid per click, and there is demonstrated social science that you get more clicks when you're pissed, right? So just think about yourselves for a second, and I'm going to sort of tell on myself, and if I'm a horrible person, I'm sorry. But I have.
It's a safe place.
I'm in a law firm. I love all my law firm partners, but there's this one guy I just can't stand. Okay, I just can't stand. And he did something that made me mad, and I got all whooped up, and I called one of my other partners, and I was rah 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 rah, and then he did this, and my friend said to me, "Hold on," he said, "Do something for me. Just picture in your mind's eye for a second the person you admire most in the firm." You got it? I said, yeah. He said, now just imagine that person had done what this guy did. Would you be behaving the same? I said, no, I wouldn't. And he said, well, then I suggest you go have a talk with yourself before you finish this conversation with me. And I really took that to heart for a whole variety of reasons, right? That this guy is my partner for better or worse. It's my job to figure it out for the institution. Like all those messages, right? Don't be a jerk, all those messages. But the message that I really took to heart is that I was having a ball. I was having fun hating this guy. I was all whooped up. I was all this. I was all that. I was having fun. And that hurt me and shamed me so much. So I remember my friend's name is Dan Reedy. I'll call him out. I call it the Reedy rule. We have the Rooney rule in Pittsburgh. This is the Reedy rule, right? Just pretend it was your best friend who did that and judge your own, behavior accordingly. I do it all the time in my own life now. But this realization that hate is fun, right? It's why we watch The Housewives. It's why we love to see, cooking shows where you're battling each other instead of nurturing and wholesomely cooking for each other, right? It is fun. And every one of us, I suspect, devolved into the fun of hating somebody else. And so you just have to resist that. But to me, anyway, when I look at this, the idea that we have a business model for news media that absorbs young people, that is based on a financial model that you click more, you make more, and we know you click more when you hate more. That seems to me to be a bad plan. Am I missing something? And if I'm not, what do we do about it?
And the corollary to that, to take it a step further, is that lies spread exponentially compared to truth and facts, right? So if misinformation and disinformation is flooding your feed because it just travels faster, that's what you're seeing.
And conspiracies.
And conspiracies.
Oh my God, I
are
love
part of that.
conspiracies. They're so cool. When I think I'm right, I want to tell somebody.
Well, I think that one of the things that you're seeing, just to not be completely depressed about media for a moment, you're seeing a huge uptick also in nonprofit news, so that you wouldn't have that click to, what did you say, click to
I don't know.
hate?
Click to hate.
Click to hate. So I think nonprofit media is a good space to be in right now in this current environment. I don't know if you agree, but there is something to be said for something that isn't monetized at all times. Like even when you think about the content that we share on YouTube is mitigated now, right? Yep. Has ads on it, it's a great platform in a lot of ways because there's a ton of people there and we will share our content there, but we're watching it very carefully, right? Because everything that we do can then be taken out, clipped, taken out of context. So we travel with all of our media as much as we can.
And I'm just going to do a shout out because we have a lot of philanthropists who are here looking for where they can make investments that matter. Think about some of these. There's some here to be had. Storytelling. We have a different panel that is really, really focused on storytelling. So I'm just going to preview this a little bit. But, I think for Scott's story, right? People were just captivated by stories. Last year, we had a lot of victims share their stories. And that's what everybody remembered. Not all the fancy academic, but the stories. How do we do a better job of storytelling, not just here's what happened, here's the bios of the victims, move on to something else? How do we do that better in all of these various forms of media?
It's a big question. I'm on the other panel as well. I actually have a film that's coming out in a couple of weeks that I've been working on that's probably one of the most difficult projects I've ever done and the only film I'll ever be in myself. But it involves a story I told 10 years ago, or 12 years ago now in Mogadishu about a young boy there who had his hand and foot cut off by Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group, when he didn't want to join. And sort of that story kind of went viral and it spiraled over the years. And he ended up getting refugee and went somewhere else. And then 10 years later, we filmed with him to take him back to Mogadishu. And I'm ruining the film for you. But halfway through our filming, he wanted to stop after his trip to Mogadishu because he had an epiphany. And he said that he hadn't told me all the right details of his story 10 years earlier. It's a complicated, long story. I know we don't have much time left, but what that, and the film that we made is actually about journalism and the stories we tell and who gets to tell them and why. And it's called The Perfect Story because this savvy kid changed small details of his story. He still had his hand and foot cut off, but he'd actually been robbing people as opposed to this narrative that he created for me, which was he wanted to stay in school and the Shabab made an example of him. And it was really brave of him to come forward. But it really made me rethink about, as a foreign correspondent and generally as stories we tell, the stories that we look for. We kind of, and I prided myself on doing difficult stories over the years, but that was a really Hollywood-esque narrative. And yes, he told me inaccurate details originally, and now we're correcting the record so that it's all there. But I was drawn to that story. That's a whole other discussion and a longer story there to unpack. But I guess what that took away was even as long as we've been in journalism, to keep asking yourself that, what kind of narratives are we putting out there? Because there's no simple narratives. And as a public, what are we looking for and trying to consume? Because we are drawn to stories like that as opposed to what is often the reality out there.
Right, and I would just say, again, back to the very first thing we talked about is usually time. So to tell a story well and make sure it's factual and journalistic, you need time. So oftentimes for frontline documentaries, we're in the edit for upwards of 4 to 5 months, just in the edit room trying to figure out the most authentic, best way to tell it. And I do agree on who's telling our stories. A lot of our reporters now tell their own stories as opposed to a narrator, because increasingly that's the right way to tell it, right? So it's the right form of storytelling. And just thinking deeply again about where youth get their stories and how they get them. One thing they love are podcasts and documentaries. It is counterintuitive, right? This idea that kids need things to be super short and quick and simple, it's not true. Data shows that people on YouTube, Netflix, all across the board, and clearly podcasts, people are really in the teen age through their 20s, just gobbling up very nuanced, very well told narrative nonfiction. It's the thing. So that's the other thing, is to not buy into this idea that it needs to be quick and really simple for a younger person to understand it and care about it.
Right. We only have 5 minutes left. So one of the things, as you know, we do is deliverables. This is the hardest part for everybody. But if there were a thing that doesn't exist now, but could or should or might already, but people don't know enough about it, what would you identify as a deliverable for the summit to consider for next year, that multidisciplinary people, other people in this room, might come together to produce before next year or to get going on before next year, that would help journalism do its job better on these issues?
I'm probably going to have to go with the model that we try to use in our other countries, which is this business of cultivating communities of practice around certain aspects of storytelling, but also of understanding the mis and disinformation landscape, the trends in the landscape, data digging, who's on it, so that instead of just reacting to it, journalists are empowered to report on it as an issue. What are the trends in mis and disinformation and hate speech? And there are people whose expertise is in that, but they themselves don't bring that to light. So anything that can improve practice in these areas, we need a specific community of practice around it.
I would just add an idea that we're working on with MIT right now, which is the idea of a living dictionary. And Ken, I'm going to call you about this, because one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to understand what words mean algorithmically. What does it mean to the algorithm? So if you take a word, and how is it then translated in algorithmic terms, as opposed to just how we think of them, and how different communities use words differently. Because I think there is a lack of sophistication around that. At least I would say that from our side of the analog media landscape, of how different groups use words, hateful words, but also just words that we think mean the same thing to you and me may not. So we're going to create a digital dictionary that I think is going to be a lot of work, but MIT is behind it, so hopefully it'll go somewhere. So I'd love to have more people think about that with us as well.
Great.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great idea. I mean, part of the challenge in this is that ultimately, whatever you guys are doing, there are people that are going to hear, they're going to read, and you have to think, I think, more deeply about how they're going to react and what they're going to do with that information. I mean, there's a story, I don't know if you guys know, but years ago, Errol Morris did a film called Mr. Death that was a brilliant film about a Holocaust denier, a guy who sort of became an icon for Holocaust deniers. And it was sort of an expose of the guy. I mean, he chipped some things out of Auschwitz and said that couldn't have happened couldn't have worked. But what happened was Morris then showed a screening of the documentary. I think it was Harvard or Yale or someplace, and a lot of people came out saying, gee, did the Holocaust really happen? He realized that, wait a minute, it's obvious to me what's wrong with this picture, but it's not obvious to the people I want to impact. So he actually had to recut it with some Robert Jan van Pelt and a few other scholars to put it in context. So I think finding out ways to use scholarship and research to think more about the end users and how to get them. I mean, if I had one thing I would love to have the end users think is not just to what Laura's point is, I feel more righteous, in my hate, but gee, this is complicated, and how do I look at the humanity of somebody I disagree with? The more we can think about how to do that effectively, I think the better off we'll all be.
Rainey, do you want the last one?
Not really. I could just quickly say, I mean, maybe just on the issues of funding, greater partnerships. I think there can be more look into. I'm looking at Amar here, who's one of our top academics if not the top academic in Canada on national security issues, having those partnerships in reporting where there just aren't the resources that there used to be anymore. So more than just having him write an op-ed here and there, but actually partnering with investigative journalists, seeing that as well as with foreign reporters, actually helping to get the training that you're looking for, but those partnerships where they're being empowered to tell their own stories.
If you can't get cash, you have to share resources and knowledge, right?
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right. I see no questions on my iPad, but some of the audience, yes.
Very quickly, this is going in a separate direction related to suppression of information. I agree that misinformation and disinformation is the big mechanism that's causing violent extremism now. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on recent stories of journalists suppressing information that they've later used for a book that would have been useful to know that might have disincentivize things. I think we know, one just came out.
Right. Well, that's a great question. I was surprised that didn't come up earlier. So Frontline, as a general rule, publishes now ahead of documentaries when we have information we think the public needs to know. That's a huge change in our ecosystem, though, to say that, we should not be holding back information. We don't believe at Frontline. But everybody makes different decisions, but we've just decided that it's really important. We can give you a lot of examples of that.
Oh, I'm not accusing.
Yeah.
I have one in my head I'm thinking of, and everybody knows who it is. But
Right.
I just realize that's getting more attention now, especially press are getting negative attention because of those decisions they make.
Right.
Fair point. Yeah, George.
Just one question. I mean, the target audiences of all of you are anyway already set in the polarized environment that we're in. So why is it so impossible to invite a Fox journalist here and be part of such a debate?
Quite.
And we did. So we're just hoping, for schedule reasons and otherwise, that there will be many other journalists here next year.
Exactly.
Journalism is a very interesting issue for us for a whole lot of reasons. So we hope it will continue. Okay, awesome. Thank you all so much for being here and for being a part of this. We're very grateful to you. Ken, thank you so much. We'll look forward to you. We'll plan better date-wise next year.
Absolutely. My wife will appreciate it.
All right, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.